3 pastors from 3 different states vanish within a single month, each one a former classmate from a now-defunct seminary with a murky past. As families search for answers, a hidden basement sealed for nearly 2 decades is uncovered in Kentucky, revealing chilling evidence tied to a long-buried scandal. What happened to these men begins with something that should have stayed forgotten and ends with a truth no one was ready to face. Reverend Elias Granger had never missed a Sunday sermon in the past 14 years. Rain, snow, illness, or even personal grief, none of it ever stopped him from standing at the pulpit of St. Mercy Chapel in rural Indiana. That's why, when the congregation sat waiting for over 20 minutes on an unusually chilly October morning, a soft anxiety began to ripple through the pews. The church's organist, a retired woman named Marlene, leaned toward Deacon Horst and whispered, "He's never late, not once. Should we check on him?" Horst, a cautious man by nature, drove straight to Elias's modest home a few blocks away. The driveway was empty. He rang the bell, then knocked, louder this time. No response. A light flickered in the hallway window, and Horst noticed something peculiar. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal. The air was still. A mug of coffee, half filled, sat cold on the kitchen counter. A pair of reading glasses rested atop an open Bible on the dining table. Elias's cell phone was still charging by the wall outlet, but there was no wallet, no keys, no coat. Within hours, local police were notified. A formal search was launched by that evening. They scoured nearby woods, local shelters, and hospitals. Nothing. It was as if Reverend Granger had walked out the front door and simply disappeared. The small town buzzed with worry, then confusion, and eventually fear. 6 days later, 200 miles away in Dayton, Ohio, the same silence echoed inside another church, St. Joseph's Parish. Reverend Thomas Keller had not arrived to teach his regular Wednesday catechism class. The school coordinator tried calling his number, then went out to the parking lot, where she saw his car parked in its usual spot. That was when she began to panic. The doors of the parish were all locked, but a janitor found a small, stained glass side door left slightly ajar. Inside, lights were still on. His sermon notes were laid out on the front pew. But the priest was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, no witnesses. Like Elias, he too had vanished without a trace. Detective Marcus Harlan, who had been assigned to Elias's case in Indiana, heard about the Dayton disappearance 3 days later through a news report. What made him pause mid-sip of coffee was the name Thomas Keller. He'd come across it before, several times, in old photographs found at Granger's home, a group of young men in black seminary robes, arms around each other, smiling into the sun. One of them had been Elias. Another, clearly labeled on the back, Tommy K. St. Roberts, 5. Harlan stared at the photo again. His gut clenched. This wasn't just a coincidence. The photo had 4 young men, 2 now missing, the others unidentified for now. He began cross-referencing St. Robert's Seminary alumni lists. It was a slow process. The seminary had closed in 2007 due to administrative restructuring, which, in bureaucratic language, meant financial trouble and something vaguely disciplinary. Names were hard to verify, but Harlan kept digging. The timing of the disappearances, so close together, the pattern eerily clean, pointed to something deliberate. Back in Kentucky, a man named Dennis Moore, pastor of a small community church outside Louisville, was sitting in his home office late Friday evening when he saw the news of Keller's disappearance. At first, he thought it was some tabloid speculation, but then he saw the face. Thomas. It was him. Older, yes, but definitely him. A casual email. A shared memory. Now Elias was gone. Thomas, too. That night, Dennis did something he hadn't done in years. He opened an old locked drawer, pulled out a faded folder labeled FR Personal, and began flipping through newspaper clippings, old emails, and a letter he had never sent. In it, he had written to an editor once, long ago, "If anything ever happens to me or the others, start by asking what we did to Andrew Wakely. We were young, we thought we were helping, we were wrong." But he had never mailed it. He had folded it, put it in the folder, and buried the folder deep in a drawer, hoping the past would stay dead. That night, Dennis didn't sleep. By morning, he had packed a small bag, left his phone on the kitchen counter, and written a note to his assistant. Emergency sabbatical. No calls. Please. By Monday, Dennis Moore had vanished. 3 men, 3 states, 3 weeks. No clear signs of foul play, no ransom, no communication. Only the quiet unraveling of lives that had once intertwined in the secluded halls of a long-closed seminary called St. Robert's. The media, once reluctant to sensationalize clergy matters, now ran headlines. Detective Harlan stood before the map in his office, red pins marking Indiana, Ohio, and now Kentucky. His eyes kept returning to that photo. 3 faces now red-circled, 1 left. His job was no longer about finding one missing man. It was about uncovering what tied these 3 together and why someone was silencing them one by one. Detective Marcus Harlan stared at his monitor in the quiet of his small Indiana office, the soft hum of the overhead lights mixing with the distant buzz of dispatch chatter from the hallway. His eyes scanned the subject line of the email forwarded from the Kentucky State Police. Disappearances clear. He clicked it open, and there, in clean, steady sentences, was a message Dennis had sent just 2 days prior to going missing. The email wasn't dramatic, but it was chilling in its clarity. To whom it may concern, it began. I understand I may not be a person of particular interest in your current investigations regarding the disappearances of Elias Granger and Thomas Keller. However, I believe I should be. I knew them both deeply personally from long before any of us wore the collar. We were classmates, brothers in every sense, at St. Robert's Seminary. And I believe what is happening to them is not random. I fear it may have to do with something that happened back then, something we never truly spoke about. I regret not speaking sooner. If anything happens to me, please investigate St. Robert's. Please speak to the faculty that were still alive from 2005. Ask about Andrew Wakely. The message ended abruptly, no signature, no elaboration. It had been sent at 2:14 a.m. from Dennis's church office IP. 4 days later, his housekeeper found the place locked, his car parked as usual behind the parish building, his keys and wallet untouched on his desk. He had vanished, just like the others. Harlan leaned back in his chair, feeling the slow pulse of dread settle deeper. 3 men, 3 locations, 3 weeks. But now the thread was no longer circumstantial. The mention of St. Robert's again solidified what he had already begun to suspect. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a pattern rooted in something old, something buried. He pulled the personnel file he had been compiling and added a new tab. Moore, Dennis, Kentucky. Then he reached for the folder labeled St. Robert's Seminary, Brackham. St. Robert's had closed in 2007, just 2 years after the trio graduated. The reason listed publicly was financial insolvency and allegations of mismanaged funds, standard for a private institution on the decline, but there were whispers in archived articles, references to disciplinary concerns, and one small headline from a now-defunct religious newspaper: Whistleblower claims abuse of power at seminary, investigation. Quietly dropped. The article named no names, gave no specifics, and cited lack of corroboration. Still, the timing matched. Harlan opened a scan of a yearbook photo he had unearthed, the graduating class of 2005. Only 6 men, 4 were now known: Elias Granger, Thomas Keller, Dennis Moore, and a man named Richard Haney. The other 2, their names were barely legible, faded ink smudged with age. He made a note to run a digital enhancement. But one thing was already clear. Granger, Keller, and Moore had not just been acquaintances. They had been close. In one candid shot, all 3 plus Haney stood shoulder to shoulder, arms over each other's backs, laughing. It wasn't a formal portrait. It was a moment captured off guard. Young men full of purpose, perhaps even arrogance, thinking their future was holy and fixed. Underneath the photo, someone had scribbled, "The 4 Pillars." SRS-5. That term, 4 Pillars, echoed in Harlan's mind. He typed it into his search engine, adding St. Robert's Seminary. One result stood out, a sermon transcript from 2004 given by a former dean in which he praised the rising class of 2005, our 4 pillars of faith, men who will carry this institution's spirit into the next century. The words now felt darkly ironic. He paused when he reached an internal document, a facility map of the old seminary grounds. One building had been marked for demolition, Hall B Residential. The file said it had sustained water damage in 2006 and was deemed unfitted. Harlan highlighted it. It might be unrelated, but then again, if there were secrets at St. Robert's, wouldn't they have started where the students had lived? As Harlan connected these fragments, he received a call from Special Agent Diana Sims of the FBI, recently assigned to the disappearances due to interstate information. She sounded calm, but her tone sharpened when Harlan mentioned the seminary. "We're already looking into it," she said. "There's chatter from some retired faculty about an incident involving a student named Wakely. You heard that name yet?" Harlan nodded. "Dennis mentioned him in the email." "Yeah," Sims said. "We're having trouble finding anything official on him. No graduation record, not even a disciplinary report. It's like he was scrubbed." Harlan frowned. "So we dig deeper." The next morning, a courier delivered an unmarked envelope to the Indiana precinct. Inside was a single photograph. No note, no return address, just an old Polaroid, 4 young men in clerical training uniforms kneeling in prayer at the edge of a candlelit chapel. Their faces were visible, but behind them, slightly blurred, stood a 5th figure, not dressed like the others, slightly hunched, watching. His face turned just enough to reveal a scar along his left cheekbone. Harlan placed it beside the yearbook photo. The 5th man was not in the official class record, and yet there he was, again. Detective Marcus Harlan didn't believe in coincidences. After receiving the anonymous photograph showing the 5 young men, 4 known, 1 obscured, he returned to the archive room of the county records office, this time with a sharper focus and a personal determination to understand what had been left behind. St. Robert's Seminary had officially closed in 2007, and its paper trail was fragmented, scattered between church archives, diocese legal offices, and what remained in public records. Most of it was benign. Budgets, graduation rosters, marked me-in inspections, but tucked inside an unlabeled file box at the back of a storage shelf marked Education, Private Institutions 2000210, he discovered something different. The folder was thin, brittle, and yellowing at the corners. Its only label was a faded ink stamp, Internal Inquiry, 2004. It hadn't been scanned, no digital copy, no mention of it in any of the official summaries Harlan had read so far. Someone had clearly left it here to be forgotten. Inside the folder was a 2-page summary labeled Confidential Disciplinary Review Board Report, October 2004. The language was deliberately vague, as most internal reports were, but the implications were unmistakable. The board had investigated an alleged incident of moral misconduct and psychological cohort. The incident had been brought to attention after a student, unnamed in the summary, had been admitted to the local hospital following a panic attack and exhibited extreme distress related to peer interactions at the seminary. The review had determined that, although no physical violence occurred, there had been prolonged peer pressure, spiritual manipulation, and inappropriate disciplinary rituals administered by fellow seminarians. 4 students had been named in the preliminary interviews: Elias Granger, Thomas Keller, Dennis Moore, and Richard Haney. Harlan's breath slowed as he read the next line. Student Haney was found to have initiated the confrontational dynamics and was dismissed from the seminary, effective immediately. Students Granger, Keller, and Moore were placed under supervised probation but allowed to continue studies under moral observation. That was it. No specifics, no witness statements, no student testimonies, just a quiet conclusion, neatly wrapped and sealed. He scanned the hospital reference at the bottom of the document. Admitted. Andrew Wakely, Mercy Memorial Hospital, September 28, 2004. There it was, the name Dennis had mentioned in his email, the name that kept surfacing in whispers. Harlan immediately contacted the records department at Mercy Memorial. Given the year and privacy laws, access wasn't guaranteed. But with the cooperation of Agent Diana Sims at the FBI, they managed to retrieve a single surviving admission record. Wakely had been admitted for acute psychological trauma, treated for 2 nights, and discharged to the care of a guardian. No follow-up, no police report, no psychiatric referral. The attending physician's note simply said, Patient experienced a sustained episode of emotional breakdown, citing religious guilt and fear of persecution from peers. Family declined further intervention. No family contact was listed, just a single phone number, now disconnected. The deeper Harlan dug, the more it became clear that Andrew Wakely had not been just another student. He had been at the center of something dark, something that St. Robert's had tried to bury beneath polite theological language and premature closures. He began to search for Richard Haney. Unlike the others, Haney had not entered ministries, no sermons, no church employment. But he wasn't a ghost, either. DMV records in Tennessee showed a Richard W. Haney living in Johnson City, renting a small apartment above a thrift store. He had a single speeding ticket on record from 2016 and an outdated phone number. That was it. Harlan drove down personally. He didn't call ahead. He needed to see the man face to face. The building was old, the kind of place that smelled of mold and mothballs, and the landlady, a tired woman in her 70s, wasn't surprised when someone came asking about that quiet fellow upstairs. She said Richard kept to himself, paid in cash, and had strange sleeping hours. When Harlan knocked, there was no answer, but just as he turned to leave, the door opened slightly. A pale face with thinning hair and eyes that twitched in small erratic motions looked out. "You from the church?" Haney asked. Harlan showed his badge. "No, I'm from Indiana. I'm investigating the disappearances of 3 men. You might know them. Granger, Keller, Moore." The name Moore seemed to strike something. Haney blinked hard, then stepped aside without a word. The apartment was sparse. No photos, no decorations, just stacks of old theology books, a mattress on the floor, and a corkboard filled with yellowing newspaper clippings. Harlan noticed several were marked in red ink, articles about clergy misconduct, missing persons, and closed institutions. Haney sat down heavily on a crate and exhaled. "You think I had something to do with it?" he said, voice flat. Harlan remained silent. Haney continued. "I didn't. I hated them for a long time, but I didn't hurt them, and I didn't forget what they did." Harlan leaned forward. "Tell me what happened with Wakely." Haney looked toward the only window in the room, its blinds shut tight. "We were all part of something we didn't understand. Andrew wasn't like us. He was intense, always praying, always scared. He said he saw demons in people, thought suffering was purification. He let us push him too far. I started it. I won't lie. But they didn't stop me. They made it worse." Said it was for his soul. He paused. Granger was the worst. He acted like it was some holy duty. Keller just followed. Moore watched, said nothing. "I got kicked out, but they stayed. The seminary needed graduates." Harold asked, "What happened to Andrew after he left?" Haney shook his head. "I don't know. He never spoke to any of us again. But I always thought, someday, he'd come back." The apartment smelled like old paper and bleach, a stale combination that hinted at someone who cleaned not to maintain, but to erase. Detective Marcus Harlan sat on a creaky folding chair across from Richard Haney, who had just poured them both instant coffee in mismatched mugs. The walls around them were bare save for a single crucifix above the door and a corkboard pinned with scattered receipts, torn grocery lists, and faded newspaper snippets about missing clergy. Haney's hands shook slightly as he stirred his coffee with a bent spoon, not from fear, it seemed more like habit, a nervous energy with nowhere to go. "So," he said without looking up, "you know who I am, and I guess you know who they were too." Harold nodded. "You said you didn't hurt them. I believe you. But I need to understand what happened back then. I need to understand what they were involved in and what this Andrew Wakely has to do with it." Haney leaned back, exhaling through his nose, and looked at Harlan for the first time with eyes that had seen far too much for a man who had barely crossed 40. "They'll never admit it. Well, I guess now they can't. But back then? It wasn't just bullying. It wasn't hazing. What we did, what we let happen, wasn't something we could confess away on Sunday and forget by Monday." He sipped his coffee, wincing at the bitterness. Andrew was quiet, bright, too intense for his own good. He was obsessed with theological purity, always quoting scripture, fasting, staying up to pray until he collapsed. And that made him stand out at St. Robert's, not in a good way. There was this belief, unspoken but real, that guys like Andrew needed to be tested. that if he wanted to be a priest, he had to be broken first. Harlan listened without interruption, letting the silence pull more truth from the air. Haney continued, voice flat. At first, it was small. Notes slipped under his door, books tampered with, cold shoulders. He'd sit in the cafeteria, and no one would join him. But it escalated. Elias and Tom started organizing these late-night spiritual exercises, they called it that. Said it was to prepare us for the spiritual battlefield. But it was about control. They'd bring Andrew down to the prayer room, make him kneel for hours, recite prayers backwards, confess made-up sins, fast for days. Dennis didn't say much. He just watched. Me? I started it, sure. I lit the match, but they made it a fire. Harlan wrote notes as Haney spoke, his pen silent on the cheap legal pad. So what was the breaking point, he asked. Haney's jaw tightened. October 2004, we made Andrew participate in something, twisted, a kind of mock exorcism. No demons, just our own guilt. Elias led it like he was possessed by righteousness. Tom held him down. I walked out halfway through. I couldn't stomach it. He was screaming, but they said it was a purification. After that night, Andrew disappeared from the seminary for 2 weeks. When he came back, he didn't speak to anyone. Then he was gone for good. Packed his things, left in the middle of the night. No goodbyes. Harlan looked up. And you never saw him again? Heron shook his head slowly. Not once. No one did. But I always felt like someone was watching me after that. I moved around a lot, changed my name for a while, thought maybe it was paranoia. But when I saw the news, Granger missing, then Keller, I knew. Knew what? Harlan asked. That Andrew never forgot. Or someone else didn't. Someone who knew. He stood, began pacing. Look, I'm not proud of who I was, but I didn't kill anyone. I've kept to myself for 18 years, never spoke to them again after seminary. I figured they built their lives pretending it never happened. Maybe it caught up with them. Maybe Andrew's back, or maybe, he paused, his expression darkening, maybe someone thinks we all deserve to pay. Harlan narrowed his eyes. Why didn't the seminary take this further? Why cover it up? Haney laughed, a bitter, tired sound. Are you kidding? You know what kind of scandal that would have caused? 4 theology students torturing a peer in the name of faith? The place was already under financial pressure. We were their poster boys. Their 4 pillars, remember? They swept it under the rug, expelled me, warned the rest to behave, let Andrew disappear, shut the place down 3 years later like that erased it. Harlan's mind raced. This wasn't just old-school rivalry or buried resentment. This was institutional rot. And whatever happened to Wakely, or whoever had learned the truth, was now playing judge, jury, and perhaps executioner. I want to help, Haney said after a long silence, if I can, if it's not too late. Harlan nodded. Then we need to find Wakely, or anyone who knew him. There has to be a trail. Haney walked over to a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Simply. Inside were old notes, scribbled phone numbers, one faded photo of Andrew during a theology conference, sitting alone on a bench, a book open on his lap, looking over his shoulder as if he'd sensed the camera. That's all I've got, Haney said. I've kept it all these years, not out of guilt, out of fear. Harlan took the folder. This could be a start. Harlan took the folder. This could be a start. Haney watched him carefully. Be careful with that. Some things aren't just buried. They're buried for a reason. Detective Marcus Harlan left Richard Haney's apartment with the thin folder clutched tight beneath his arm, his mind already churning through the implications. Names on a page were becoming real people, flawed, frightened, capable of cruelty and silence. Back at his hotel, he laid out the contents of Haney's over on the bedspread, a yellowed photonova frake of Andrew Wakely, some hand-scribbled notes, and 3 disconnected phone numbers with Tennessee and Pennsylvania area codes, long out of service. The photo drew him in. Wakely, barely 22, sat hunched on a park bench, one arm folded tightly across his midsection, like a reflex of self-protection. His eyes caught mid-turn toward something behind him. He didn't look surprised or afraid, just aware, as if he had been anticipating the camera all along. The next morning, Harlan contacted the Archdiocese Archives Office and requested full access to St. Robert's Seminary records from 2000 to 2007. He was met with mild resistance until he mentioned the missing clergy and the FBI's involvement. By noon, he was seated in a cold, windowless room on the second floor of the diocese's building, surrounded by crates of files labeled. 3 hours into sorting through enrollment records and disciplinary summaries, he found what he had come for. Wakely Andrew D., enrolled fall 2001. Majored in moral theology, GPA 3.9, seminars noted, spiritual leadership, pastoral counseling. In the status column next to his name, someone had written in shaky ink, withdrawn spring 2000. There was no official reason listed, no exit interview, no transfer notice, just a stamped withdrawn and a red underline. Harlan double-checked the housing logs. Andrew had lived in Hall B, same as Granger, Keller, Moore, and Haney. That wing had sustained water damage in 2006, right after the class graduated, and had been sealed shortly before the seminary sat down for good. Further digging uncovered an internal memo addressed to the Dean of Students, dated February 2005. Subject: A.D. Wakely. Student has requested early withdrawal from the seminary, citing personal hardship. Financial aid to be discontinued immediately. Record to be archived. No further action required. But then, in the margins, inertia had scribbled a log from January 1st. Cullen present. That name triggered something. Harlan sifted through a separate stack of faculty files until he found it. Father Edward Cullen, Assistant Dean of Student Life, served from 1997 to 2005. Known for being strict, traditionalist, highly private. Retired in early 2006, currently residing in a Jesuit care facility in southern Illinois. Harlan didn't wait. He booked the earliest flight the next day. The care home was quiet, ivy-covered, and smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. A nun escorted Harlan to the library, where Father Cullen sat in a warm leather armchair near the window, flipping through a battered copy of The Imitation of Christ. He was in his late 70s now, his features sharp despite the soft tremor in his hands. When Harlan introduced himself and mentioned Andrew Wakely, Cullen's gaze didn't flicker. Instead, he nodded once and set his book aside. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. "He was a special boy, too earnest, too pure for that place." Harlan leaned forward. "Can you tell me what happened in 2005? Why did he leave?" Cullen hesitated, then motioned for Harlan to follow him down a narrow hallway lined with dusty bookshelves. He stopped at a small study room, closed the door, and lowered his voice. "I remember the day clearly. It was snowing, mid-January. I was called into Conference Room C because there was an incident involving Wakely and the others, Granger, Keller, Moore. Haney had already been expelled months earlier. I walked in and found Andrew sitting on the far side of the table, shoulders hunched, face blotchy from crying. He wasn't speaking. Elias stood behind him, hand on his shoulder, like a shepherd claiming his lamb. Keller looked down at the table. Moore stood near the window, arms crossed. The room was thick with something unspoken. I asked what had happened. Elias said it was a misunderstanding about spiritual boundaries. I asked Andrew if he agreed. He just stared at the floor. Harlan took notes furiously. "And what did you do next?" Cullen sighed. "I recommended counseling. Taylor Andrew he could take time off." He nodded once, and that was it. 2 weeks later I got a memo saying he had formally withdrawn and left campus. No forwarding address, no phone number. It was like he erased himself. "Do you think he was coerced?" Harlan asked. Cullen looked away. "Yes, but it was complicated. Elias was charismatic. He had the faculty wrapped around his finger. The administration didn't want a scandal. They needed clean records to keep the donations coming, so they let him go. They let all of it go." "Did anyone ever speak to Andrew again?" Cullen shook his head. "But stout enough to leave that I found something strange. Someone had placed a folded piece of paper under my door. No envelope, just a note in Wakely's handwriting. It said, 'I tried to believe, but belief doesn't stop what men do in the dark.'" Harlan sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling like dust on his skin. A man had been broken within those walls. 3 others had moved on, built ministries, gathered congregations. And now, one by one, they were vanishing. The records confirmed what no one wanted to admit. Andrew Wakely hadn't just left. He had been pushed out, silenced, perhaps destroyed, and nobody Not even his own mentors had stopped it. Margaret Wakely had not heard her son's name spoken aloud in years, not by friends, not by relatives, not even by herself. After Andrew's disappearance from St. Robert's in 2005, silence had become her armor, one forged from unanswered letters, dormant grief, and photographs that never aged. She had learned to live in the quiet space between denial and mourning, convinced that her son had simply chosen to disappear, to step away from everything, including her. But that armor cracked one rainy morning when she opened her email and saw a subject line that read, "You don't know the truth." The message body was blank, except for a single sentence, "Ask about the basement in Hall B." There was no signature, no address, no indication of who sent it, but Margaret's hands trembled as she read it again and again, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before picking up the phone. Detective Marcus Harlan received the forwarded message from the local precinct that same afternoon. He recognized the name immediately, Margaret Wakely. Until now, Andrew's family had remained entirely outside the investigation, unreachable and quiet. Harlan drove to her modest home in northern Kentucky the next day, greeted by a woman whose face bore the weight of years without answers. Margaret was composed, her grief worn smooth with time, but the pain flickered in her eyes as she handed him a printed copy of the email. "I never believed he just left," she said, voice steady. "But I stopped asking. No one wanted to listen, not the school, not the diocese, not the police. They said he was of age, that he had free will. But he wasn't like that. He wouldn't have left without telling me why." Harlan asked if she recognized the sender or the phrase, but Margaret shook her head. "Hall B was where he lived, that I remember. He used to complain about the cold, said it smelled like mildew." The detail caught Harlan's attention. Every student of interest, Keller, Moore, Haney, had also lived in Hall B. The building had since been converted into part of a sprawling retirement facility on the edge of the old seminary grounds. When the school closed, the property was sold to a private development group that repurposed its dormitories into assisted living quarters and memory care units. Hall B had become formal requests to conduct a search of the facility, citing ongoing federal investigation into missing persons. After 2 days of administrative hurdles, the center's board agreed to allow access to their maintenance blueprints and historical records. The current property manager, a meticulous man named Jennings, welcomed Harlan and FBI agent Diana Sims with a curated hospitality that suggested both curiosity and unease. "We've had no issues in that building," Jennings assured, walking them through the east wing. "Some of the original architecture remains, but we've updated all safety protocols. The basement was sealed off during renovations, structural instability according to the original inspection team." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "You ever open it since then?" Jennings shook his head. "No, it's not even on the current access map. The space was walled off during the 2008 retrofit. We don't use it." Harlan asked to see the original blueprints. In the corner of the staff office, tucked inside a plastic sleeve pinned to the wall, was a hand-drawn floor plan from 2002. Hall B's basement was clearly labeled 2 stairwells, a boiler room, and a section marked Spiritual Practice Room, unfinished. On the current map, that entire section was blank. The maintenance foreman, a skeptical man named Turner, agreed to assist. The old stairwell behind the linen closet had been plastered over, its entry concealed behind a sheetrock wall. The team cut through with saws and crowbars, dust filling the air, exposing a rusted metal door with a padlock whose key had long since vanished. When they pried it open, the air that rushed out was thick with damp and disuse. The steps leading downward groaned beneath their feet, and the flashlight beams revealed flaking paint, water stains, and old religious posters curling at the edges. The basement had not been touched in nearly 2 decades. They entered a narrow corridor lined with small, locked rooms, bare concrete, single cots, no windows. One door bore faint markings scratched into the paint, "Silence is salvation." Another had a broken rosary nailed into the wood. At the end of the hall was a larger chamber, square and empty, except for a collapsed wooden platform, 2 rusted chairs, and a broken crucifix hanging sideways on the far wall. Agent Sims whispered, "What the hell were they doing down here?" Harlan said nothing. In the corner, beneath a rotted bookshelf, he noticed a pile of discolored folders tied with string. He knelt, brushed off the dust, and opened the top one. Inside were student reflection journals, mandatory for all St. Robert's seminarians, though these had never been collected officially. The entries were sporadic, signed with initials. One read, AAW, February 3, 2005. They said I should be grateful that God purifies through humiliation. I nodded. I always nod, but I don't believe anymore, and this time with actual tears inside of whispering. We thought that meant it was working. Harlan felt a chill settle deep in his chest. This wasn't just a forgotten basement. It was a place deliberately hidden, a room of reckoning that the school had buried with bricks and silence. The deeper Detective Marcus Harlan and Agent Diana Sims moved through the hidden basement of Hall B, the more it felt less like an old building and more like the preserved shell of a forgotten ritual. The air was dense and unmoving, as if it had not been disturbed in years, and the walls, once painted a dull institutional beige, were now cracked with streaks of mold, their surfaces damp to the touch. The corridor narrowed near the farthest corner, where a low splintered door stood partially ajar. Turner, the maintenance foreman, hesitated before pushing it open. The hinges shrieked under rust, and what emerged on the other side was something none of them could have anticipated. A single room, no larger than a janitor's closet, sat cloaked in a faint mustiness that carried the trace of something older than decay. Guilt, maybe, or memory. The walls were completely covered, not with paint or plaster, but with pinned and glued scraps of paper. Hundreds of them, overlapping like fish scales, each one hand-written in faint pencil or smeared ink. In the center of the room stood a wooden chair, its legs uneven and frame warped by moisture, positioned deliberately in the center of a narrow rectangle of floor scrubbed cleaner than the rest. Beside it, a rusted bucket lay tipped over, long dried streaks marking where something, water, perhaps something else, had once been repeatedly poured and left to soak. Agent Sims bent down to examine a section of the wall. She read aloud, "I lied to my mother about breaking the lamp. I was 5. Then another, I took bread from the chapel kitchen during Lent." She looked back at Harlan, confused. Their confessions. Harlan approached the chair, his boots scuffing on the gritty cement. He stared at the note nearest his shoulder, slightly newer than the others. "I thought God would speak back. He never did." Sims said nothing, her eyes scanning the dense surface of the room. Most pages were unsigned. Some were dated in the early 2000s. One was dated January 2005. AAU, it read, shaky and small. "They made me kneel and confess every night." I wasn't the only one. Near the doorframe, a single sheet of paper had been nailed directly into the wood, its corners yellowed but still legible. In a cleaner, more deliberate script, it read, "This is where sin was named, where pain was virtue. They called it discipline. I called it purgatory." Sims turned to Harlan. "This wasn't sanctioned. This wasn't anything close to seminary guidance." Harlan stepped back from the chair and scanned the narrow space. The door had once locked from the outside, its latch still intact, corroded but clearly designed to trap someone in. There was no knob on the inside, just smooth metal. He imagined a young man, Andrew, maybe others, forced into this room night after night, pressed into that chair, told to speak until they believed they were cleansed. He photographed the room in sections, taking care not to disturb anything. In one corner, beneath a loose floor tile, Sims discovered a stack of damp cloths, torn from what looked like bed sheets. Some were stained dark with old marks, perhaps ink, perhaps something else. Folded inside one was a broken rosary, the beads worn smooth from handling. They gathered what evidence they could, then made their way back up into the main building. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows through the leafless trees. Harlan stood in the parking lot, his hands on his hips, staring at the old brick facade of Hall B. "It was more than abuse," he said. "It was systematic, controlled, and nobody stopped it." Sims nodded. "You think this was Andrew's cell?" Harlan didn't answer right away. "If it was, then that line, 'I wasn't the only one,' means we haven't accounted for everything. There were others. Maybe some never spoke. Maybe some didn't make it." They returned to their field office and began cross-referencing old student logs from 2000 to 2005, focusing on anyone who had dropped out unexpectedly, Anyone who had dropped out unexpectedly. Anyone who had dropped out unexpectedly. Names surfaced. 2 students who withdrew mid-term without transferring. 1 who had an abrupt hospitalization. All had lived in Hall B. Harlan printed out the confessions they had transcribed, aligning them by handwriting style and date. Patterns emerged, repeated phrases, cycles of guilt, obsessions with sin and silence. The same 3 or 4 initials kept appearing, e.g. TKA, DM. Granger, Keller, Moore. Sometimes next to directives, e.g. says I must name it aloud. TK watched me, didn't blink. DM asked nothing, just wrote it down. Harlan underlined each of those in red ink. They didn't just participate, he muttered. They led it. But the most disturbing entry was one written in a jagged scrawl on the back of a torn envelope, dated March 2, 2005. It read, I saw someone else tonight, not one of us, watching from the hallway. The signature at the bottom was simply a cross. Harlan circled it. This wasn't over when Andrew left, he said. Someone else stayed behind. When Detective Marcus Harlan returned to Johnson City, the winter air had turned sharper, biting at his coat collar as he made his way back up the stairs to Richard Haney's apartment. He carried with him photographs from the basement of Hall B, images of the confession-covered walls, the locked door, and the solitary wooden chair in the middle of that decaying room. Richard answered the door without surprise, as if he had been waiting for this moment to circle back. Harlan didn't speak immediately. He stepped inside, dropped the manila envelope onto the table, and opened it slowly, laying the pictures out one by one. Richard looked down at them, his hands in his pockets, jaw tightening. It's still there, he muttered. I thought they would have torn it down. Harlan remained silent for a moment before speaking. You said before that what happened to Andrew wasn't just bullying, that it turned into something more. I need to know exactly what that was. Richard sat slowly, his shoulders slumping like a man who'd carried a weight too long. It was supposed to be a purification exercise. That's what they called it. Elias came up with it, said Andrew needed to be cleansed, said he held secrets, that guilt made him impure. It started as a private prayer circle, just the 4 of us and Andrew. Late at night, in the old practice room in Hall B, no faculty knew. Harold didn't interrupt. He needed the truth to unfold naturally. Richard continued, voice low and deliberate. What would make Andrew kneel in front of that chair, always the same spot, lights low, candles lit. He had to confess, every night, real sins, imagined ones, it didn't matter. Elias told him God wouldn't hear him unless he humbled himself completely. They made him speak louder, clearer. Then Tom started recording it, said they needed evidence of repentance. Andrew didn't know at first. When he found out, he begged them to stop, said it was private, sacred. That's when they started threatening to release the tapes. Harlan's face stayed neutral, but his grip on his notebook tightened. They recorded his confessions? Yes, Richard nodded. On an old handheld recorder kept. They said it was leverage, said it would keep Andrew in line, make sure he didn't slip back into sin. But I think it was more than that. I think they enjoyed the power. Richard rubbed his temples with both hands, breathing through his nose. I couldn't watch anymore. After the 5th night, I told them I was out. Elias said I was weak. Moore didn't say anything. He just watched, like always. I went back to my room and didn't go down again. A week later, Andrew disappeared, and I said nothing, not to the dean, not to anyone. I was already on thin ice after the incident in '04. If I spoke up, I would have been expelled for good. Harlan stepped closer. You knew something terrible had happened, and you stayed quiet. Richard's voice cracked. Yes, and I've lived with that silence every single day since. Harlan pulled a photo from the bottom of the pile, the handwritten note found near the basement door. They made me kneel and confess every night. I wasn't the only one. He slid it toward Richard. Did Andrew ever say anything about others? Richard stared at the note for a long time. There was one night, he whispered something, barely audible, said, they did this before. I thought he meant the other students had endured it, but now, maybe he wasn't the first. Maybe we were just continuing something older. Harlan sat opposite him, the air between them heavy with implication. I believe someone, Andrew or someone who knew, has been waiting all these years, watching. The others? Granger, Keller, Moore. They paid for what they did. If you want to avoid the same fate, I need every detail. Where the tapes were kept. Who else knew? Richard nodded slowly. They kept them in a locked box. Granger had the key, said it was safeguarding souls. After graduation, I don't know what happened to them, but if you find Granger's belongings, they might still be out there. Harold stood. We'll find them, but this time the truth won't stay buried. The first break in months came not from digital records or archived files, but from a man named Leon Mathers, a retired maintenance worker who had served at St. Robert's Seminary until its closure in 2007. Mathers had kept mostly to himself over the years, living in a quiet suburb outside St. Louis. It was only after local news began circulating stories about the reopened investigation into the missing clergy that his daughter contacted the authorities, urging them to speak with her father. When Detective Marcus Harlan arrived, Mathers greeted him with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been waiting nearly 2 decades for someone to ask the right question. They sat at a cluttered kitchen table surrounded by faded wallpaper and ceramic knickknacks. Harlan listened closely as Mathers recalled a night from the spring of 2005, a night he had never been able to forget. It was just after midnight, Mathers began, and I was finishing up my rounds when I saw 2 guys carrying boxes out behind Hall B. No lights, no talking, just shadows. I thought it was students sneaking out with beer or something, but then I noticed what they were dumping. Black VHS cases, dozens of them, into the burn pit near the edge of the property. That was odd. We had digital cameras by then. Nobody used tapes anymore. Harlan leaned forward. And you didn't report it? Mathers looked down, ashamed. No one ever asked me. No one cared what the janitors saw, and with the school shutting down a couple years later, I figured maybe it wasn't my place. Harlan requested access to the seminary's old waste removal records, digging through contractor logs and disposal manifests until he found a reference to a discontinued off-site burn pit, now overgrown and abandoned on unused church land. With a search warrant and excavation team, they returned to the coordinates, digging beneath layers of ash and rubble until they unearthed a rusted metal drum, half concealed, its contents encased in melted plastic and soot. Miraculously, several VHS tapes had survived the burn, their magnetic coating scorched but recoverable. The FBI's forensic media lab spent 2 weeks carefully restoring what they could. Out of 14 tapes, 5 contained playable footage. The first few showed empty rooms, a few of a camera setup, but the 4th tape, the 4th was different. Agent Deanna Sims called Harlan into the viewing room at Quantico without preamble. She pressed play without speaking. The screen lit up with a dim, grainy view of what was unmistakably the basement chamber in Hall B. The wooden chair stood in frame, surrounded by candlelight. The audio crackled, warped by heat damage, but clear enough. A voice, young, strained, whispered, "I'm sorry. I lied." It was Andrew Wakely. His face was barely visible, hunched over, shoulders shaking. Then, from somewhere off camera, another voice answered, calm, cold, authoritative. "You'll thank us later." Harlan froze. The tone was unmistakable. It wasn't rage, it wasn't punishment, it was conviction. Sims played the clip again. "We ran voice comparisons. It's a 92% match with Elias Granger." The weight of that sentence hung between them. Granger, long thought a charismatic leader, a man whose sermons had inspired hundreds, had orchestrated something far darker behind closed doors. "We don't have footage of what happened after that," Sims continued, "but it's enough. Enough to prove a pattern of coercion. Enough to prove a pattern of coercion." Harlan stared at the screen, watching Andrew's trembling hands as he gripped his knees. "It wasn't discipline. It was domination." Sims nodded. "And they recorded it to relive it." The next step was painful but necessary. Margaret Wakely was brought into a secure room and shown only the audio portion of the recovered clip. Harlan made sure she understood she could stop at any time, but she insisted. When Andrew's voice came through the speaker, her hand flew to her mouth. The tears came silently, followed by a whisper. He was just a boy. She didn't ask for more. She didn't need to. What had once been vague speculation had become undeniable. Her son had been broken not by faith, but by the hands of those who wielded it as a weapon. The evidence shifted the tone of the investigation. The media picked up fragments of the story, enough to spark questions, but not enough to expose victims. Former students began reaching out, some anonymously, some braver than others, admitting that Hall B had always had a reputation. One message sent to Harlan's inbox simply read, "We weren't allowed to speak, but I remember the chair and the prayers, and the way he cried." They traced the source of the VHS tapes to a storage locker, once rented by Thomas Keller under a pseudonym. It had been cleared out shortly after Andrew disappeared, but rental records confirmed the timeline. Everything alarmed: the voices, the room, the silence that followed. But the most haunting part wasn't what was seen, it was what was absent. In every clip, Andrew's face never met the camera directly. He never looked into the lens. He always stared off, as if watching something behind the operator. As if he knew this wasn't the worst to come. The press conference was held in a plain room at the Lexington County Courthouse, its beige walls and humming fluorescent lights casting a sterile pall over what was supposed to be a significant breakthrough. Detective Marcus Harlan stood beside a federal agent and a woman in her late 30s who had only recently contacted their office, Michaeline Trask, a former seminarian at St. Robert's, now a practicing attorney in Louisville. She had remained silent for years, buried beneath professional obligations and a career built on precision and composure, until the news of the recovered VHS tapes and the reopened investigation stirred something long locked away. She read from her prepared statement with steady hands and a voice that rarely wavered. In the spring of 2005, I was nearing the end of my third year at St. Robert's when I was summoned late one evening to a private meeting with Elias Granger, Thomas Keller, and Dennis Moore. I was told there were concerns about my theological stance and emotional stability. When I questioned their reasoning, Granger presented me with what he called proof of moral deviation, an audio recording of a student in distress, confessing thoughts of lust and disobedience. The implication was that the voice on the tape was mine. It wasn't. I told them so. They responded by threatening to submit the tape to the faculty disciplinary board unless I agreed to voluntary withdrawal. I left the seminary within the week. Her statement sent ripples across every major media outlet within hours. Trask had no incentive to fabricate her account. Her career, her record, her credibility all stood as testament to her integrity. Her testimony added an undeniable layer to the mounting evidence that the so-called room of confession but one of psychological leverage and coercion. The footage of Andrew Wakely, the recovered journals, the notes from Hall B's basement, and now Trask's statement pointed to a system of control disguised as theology. Meanwhile, search teams deployed across Kentucky's rural lake regions were in the midst of a separate investigation. A park ranger had reported a man's body washed up along the western bank of Lake Barkley, near a cove often used by hikers but rarely patrolled in winter. The corpse bore no signs of trauma beyond water exposure and minor abrasions from drift debris. Identification came swiftly. The man's fingerprints matched Elias Granger, confirmed through clerical records and former employment files. His car had been abandoned several miles away, parked at the edge of a boat launch. A coat and wallet were found folded neatly inside. There was no note, but the circumstances pointed toward suicide. It was a quiet end to a man whose influence had cast a long, destructive shadow over the lives of others. Yet even in death he left more questions than answers. Thomas Keller and Dennis Moore remained unaccounted for. Their phones were dead, financial records dormant, last known sightings nearly a month old. Some theorized they had fled. Others whispered they feared the same fate as Granger. A few speculated that retribution, whether by guilt, accident, or something darker, had simply caught up with all three. But no official determination was reached. The state police refused to close the investigation. Margaret Wakely, now seen as a figure of quiet perseverance, stood before a growing audience and demanded full accountability, not just from the church, but from every institution that had turned away when boys like Andrew were hurting. "My son did not leave this world without cause," she said. "He was silenced, and now I will not be." Public outcry led to the creation of a statewide task force to investigate abuse and misconduct in private religious education facilities. Whistleblowers came forward, alumni began telling their stories, and though not all of them had tapes or basements to point to, their accounts shared a common thread over compassion. Harlan submitted his final report weeks later. In it, he detailed the sequence of events as best it could be known, from Richard Haney's initial testimony to the confessions extracted from Hall B's forgotten walls. He concluded with a statement that resonated beyond law enforcement. This was not a case of isolated misconduct. It was a culture of silence, one maintained through fear and wrapped in religious language. That silence has now been broken, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold. The last piece of evidence entered into the case file came from an envelope found among Granger's possessions, marked simply Wakely. Inside was a single photograph printed from an old film roll. It showed 4 young men in seminary uniforms, Granger, Keller, Moore, and Andrew. They stood side by side in the courtyard of St. Robert's, the chapel spire behind them, each holding a candle. Only Andrew looked directly at the camera. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something the others lacked, a question perhaps, or the weight of knowing something the rest refused to admit. No one could say for certain if Andrew Wakely had survived those final nights. His body was never found. His name remained absent from any legal certificate of death, but the room, the tapes, and the stories told by those he left behind ensured that he would never again be forgotten. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true mystery narratives that stay with you long after the final word. What part of this case shocked you the most? Do you think Andrew ever made it out alive? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts.